Hello everyone, and welcome to Western Civ 2. My name is Ryan P. Johnson, and today's lesson will focus on the emergence, reign, and eventual defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. For my current batch of students, as always, there's a quiz located in the Napoleon module in the course LMS. Please access that quiz now and follow along with this presentation. For anyone tuning in that is not one of my current students, thanks for joining us. I appreciate the support, and please like this video and subscribe to my channel. I think my students have likely had enough time to access the quiz, so on with the show. As Napoleon was a military man who's known mostly, on a popular level, as a successful general, we should begin there. Napoleon Bonaparte came from a minor noble family on the island of Corsica. As such, pre-French Revolution, he would have only risen so far in the ranks of the French military. The Revolution, however, with its mantra of careers open to talent, provided Napoleon with the opportunity he needed. However, by 1795, he was a poor artillery officer who was nearly executed because he was friends with one of Maximilien Robespierre's relatives. Important connections within the new Directory government, though, saved his life, and eventually put him in charge of the French armies in northern Italy in 1796 and 97. During those campaigns, he defeated both the Piedmontese and Austrians in battle. He earned the goodwill and loyalty of his troops by paying them with plunder from the regions he conquered for France. He set up client republics that would be nominally independent, but take their cues from France. And he personally negotiated deals with the Austrians, something the Directory back in Paris was not happy about. However, Napoleon pacified them by sending treasures from Italy, including valuable works of art, many of which are still in Paris. After this success, Napoleon was given command of the Egyptian expedition. The purpose of invading Egypt was to harm British trade by cutting off one of the routes to India. Despite having initial success landing in Egypt and fighting off an attack from the Egyptian army, the entire French fleet was sunk by the British, stranding Napoleon and his troops in North Africa. After engaging in a few additional battles and witnessing the scholars he brought along discover the Rosetta Stone, Napoleon secretly slipped out of Egypt and was back in France in 1799. His army, however, he had left to be worn down, defeated, and imprisoned. Once back in Paris, he teamed up with Abbé Sieyès, author of the pamphlet What is the Third Estate? Sieyès had survived the revolution and was still looking to influence politics. The unpopularity of the Directory prompted Sieyès to devise a complicated system of checks and balances to ensure no group became as powerful as the Committee of Public Safety had been. Sieyès, however, needed someone popular to give his plan greater recognition, and hitched his wagon to Napoleon. For Sieyès, Napoleon was simply a soldier who would not get in the way of Sieyès' grand plan. He severely underestimated Napoleon's political acumen, though, and Bonaparte quickly secured, after the overthrow of the Directory, the position of first consul. The position of consul is an old Roman office, the top office of the Republic that was usually accompanied by the power to command legions. In the new French system, there were three, but the first consul held all of the real power. Napoleon was able to claim such a powerful position and maintain control over it due to his continued success on the battlefield. Between 1800 and 1814, over 2 million men were conscripted into the French army, giving Napoleon the manpower he needed to overwhelm his opponents. He maintained the revolutionary principle of careers open to talent, leading to skilled commanders rising to the top and creating high morale among the troops. Napoleon also combined all of France's armies into one grand army that he personally commanded, thus eliminating the problem of potential challengers leading armies loyal to them. In addition to paying his troops with plunder, Bonaparte endeared himself to his soldiers by fighting at the front, even having over a dozen horses shot out from underneath him. His overall strategy was to separate his opponents and defeat them one at a time, using fast-moving contingents to overpower his enemies numerically at the point of attack. He was aided in this strategy by the fact that his opponents did not coordinate their actions for over a decade, constantly playing right into Napoleon's hands. He defeated Austria in 2 decisive battles in 1800, and again at Ulm in 1805. The same year, he defeated the Austrians and Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz. He defeated the Prussians in 1806 at the battles of Jena and Auerstadt, and the Russians at Friedland in 1807. During the early years of the 19th century, Napoleon was unbeatable on land. The only setbacks Napoleon encountered during this period were at sea and in the Caribbean colonies. Britain ruled the high seas, and the French simply could not match them. At the naval battle of Trafalgar, the British dominated the French fleet while not losing a single vessel. Across the Atlantic, despite imprisoning resistance leader Toussaint Louverture, Saint-Domingue proved a quagmire for the French. And the combination of determination on the part of the people and disease forced Napoleon to give up the idea of resecuring control of the newly independent Haiti. Bonaparte continued the pattern set when he was in charge of the French armies in 1796 and 97. Some lands were directly annexed to France, meaning they lost their independence and legally became part of the French nation. Other territories were completely reorganized, gaining new names, new borders, and new leaders. Many of the German states were organized into the Confederation of the Rhine. Northern Italy was annexed to France, while the rest of Italy was divided into 2 states, the kingdoms of Italy and Naples, respectively. To manage the conquered territories, Bonaparte installed relatives as rulers. His brother Joseph first served as King of Naples in 1806, and then King of Spain 2 years later. The Kingdom of Naples was given to his brother-in-law, General Joachim Murat. His younger brother Louis was named King of Holland, while his stepson, Eugene de Beauharnais, was named Viceroy of Italy. Finally, when Napoleon's second wife gave birth to a son and heir, the infant was immediately proclaimed King of Rome. The tremendous success Napoleon was having through wars of conquest gave him the political capital to push through changes in French government. Napoleon created a much more centralized system of governance that blended elements of revolutionary France and the Ancien Régime that came before. Though there were elements of resistance to Napoleon's burgeoning power, many people across France were simply exhausted from a decade of revolutionary change and wanted the stability that Napoleon's regime provided. As first consul, Napoleon had much more power than the other two, including the power to choose the members of the Council of State. The council crafted all laws and was one of three bodies that made up the new French legislature. All three bodies were restricted in their powers, and none had any ability to check the first consul's decisions. Abbé Sieyès, who had designed much of this legislative framework, was quickly shunted aside, as Napoleon proved just as adept in politics as he was in war. In 1801, Napoleon and Pope Pius VII came to an agreement that allowed Catholicism back into France, but made it subservient to the state. Although Protestantism was also allowed, Catholicism was accepted as the official religion, and in return, the Pope agreed to retroactively approve the sale of all church lands during the Revolution. This agreement, known as the Concordat, would not last long, as the Pope eventually became an open and staunch opponent of the regime. The new government system was also not democratic or representative in any way. Official censorship was reimposed, and the number of newspapers in Paris reduced eventually to 4. Former Jacobins and any others Napoleon believed to be suspicious were targeted for harassment and oppression. Sham elections were held that gave people little real choice. Finally, in 1804, Napoleon gave up all pretense about France's political organization when he crowned himself emperor and declared the First French Empire. One of the elements of pre-revolutionary France reintroduced by Napoleon was a hierarchy of titles known as the Legion of Honor. Membership in the Legion was gained through merit, almost exclusively through some sort of battlefield heroics. Once in the Legion, members were provided with titles reminiscent of the Ancien Régime, such as Duke and Baron, as well as land grants and lifelong pensions. Perhaps, though, the longest-lasting change of Bonaparte's regime was the introduction of the Civil Code, a new system of laws for France that touched on all aspects of life. The Civil Code established a patriarchal state, giving fathers power over their wives and children. Kids under 16 who disobeyed their father's orders could be imprisoned for a month with no trial, for example. Women were subordinate to men, as husbands controlled all family property, and women could not bring lawsuits to court, nor could they sell any property or make a business arrangement without their husband's permission. The code completed a project the revolutionaries had tried but failed, a comprehensive law code that applied to everyone across all French territories. The code also established a series of military secondary schools called lycées that provided state-run education to more young people in France than ever before. In fact, the lycée system is still the backbone of the French education system, just without the uniforms and military drills. The Civil Code also included provisions about employers and their workers. Workers were required to carry cards attesting to their good behavior. Worker organizations were forbidden, and in court, employers were given the benefit of the doubt, while workers were often forced to have their own supervisors represent them. Part of the new educational system was an emphasis on science. Napoleon was a major patron of scientists and scientific discoveries. The scholars he brought with him to Egypt discovered the Rosetta Stone, which allowed for the translation of Egyptian hieroglyphs. New discoveries in medicine, archaeology, and gases were all made under Napoleon's patronage. His largesse did not extend, however, to literature, which he viewed as a means of criticizing him and his regime, something he would not allow. Many writers, including the famous Germain de Stael, were forced into exile in order to continue their writing. Proponents of the Catholic Church also took issue with Napoleon's treatment of the Church and his continuation of revolutionary ideas like careers being open to talent. Due to France's failure in war at sea, instead of bringing battle to England, Napoleon tried a form of economic warfare called the Continental system. Under this system, all of mainland Europe, which was either under Napoleon's direct control, that of one of his relatives, or was allied to him, was prevented from buying, selling, or trading any products with Great Britain. The idea was to simply starve them of customers, causing businesses to fail, causing nationwide economic ruin, and forcing England to come to terms with Napoleon. England, however, remained economically strong despite taking an initial hit, and black markets soon opened up across Europe that allowed British goods to still find their way onto the mainland while enriching British merchants and artisans. There was resistance from secret societies that opposed the growing tyranny of Napoleon. In Italy, the Carbonari, or charcoal workers, formed clandestine groups that worked to undermine Napoleon's regime. Perhaps the greatest source of resistance, however, were Spain and Portugal, which both bridled under the control of Napoleon's family. 250,000 troops were essentially stationed in Spain permanently to try and keep the peace. But their presence only sparked more resistance born of nationalistic feelings. Indeed, one of the most important and long-term consequences of Bonaparte's attempt to colonize Europe was the emergence of nationalism as a rallying and unifying force. Throughout the rest of this class, we'll see the force of nationalism emerge again and again. Thankfully for the rest of Europe, Napoleon's military successes would begin to ebb after 1810. By that year, there were only two completely free nations in Europe, Great Britain and Russia. Russia, under Alexander I, had been an ally of Napoleon's, but the alliance broke down over the implementation of the Continental system. Alexander wished to continue trading with the more industrialized Britain in order to get modern products that Russia did not produce itself. The dispute would cause Alexander to break his allegiance with Napoleon and side with the British. Bonaparte decided that military intervention was necessary to bring Russia back into the fold, so he led an army of 680,000 men and 250,000 horses into Russia in 1812. Russia was well aware of Napoleon's strategy and countered by simply denying him the decisive pitched battle he sought. Russian troops simply fell back east, deeper and deeper into Russia, while Napoleon followed, allowing his supply lines to stretch dangerously thin. There was one major engagement between the two in September of 1812. The Battle of Borodino cost the lives of 30,000 French troops and 45,000 Russians, but was not decisive. The Russians continued to fall back, while Napoleon continued to follow. Alexander even organized the evacuation of the city of Moscow and set the city on fire to deny the French any resources or supplies. By the time the invading army reached the city, 3/4 of it was engulfed in flames. Napoleon, realizing what was happening, turned his army around to head for home. It was at this time that winter began to set in. I don't know if you know this, but it gets like really cold in Russia. So if you're going to invade the country, you have to either do it in summer and fall or prepare for the harsh winter. As fatigue, hunger, and cold took their toll on the French troops, Russian attacks harried them the entire way. Napoleon abandoned his men and set off for France to begin regrouping. Of the 680,000 men that entered Russia that summer, fewer than 100,000 made it out. It was a catastrophe for the French military, one that Napoleon would not recover from. Smelling blood in the water, other nations bristling under Napoleonic control began to rise up. Financed by the British, a coalition of Russian, Austrian, Prussian, and Swedish forces defeated Napoleon at the Battle of the Nations in 1813. The emperor abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba off the west coast of Italy. 2 years later, hearing of conflict in France due to the reinstitution of the Bourbon monarchy, Napoleon managed to escape from Elba and landed in southern France. Armies sent to stop him defected and sided with him. Louis XVIII, brother of the beheaded Louis XVI, fled Paris and pleaded for help from other European nations. I can imagine some of those nations going, ugh, really? We have to deal with this again? Once again, a coalition of forces was arrayed against Bonaparte, with British troops being led by the Duke of Wellington. Napoleon hoped to split the British from their Prussian allies and defeat them one at a time. But the British held out until their allies arrived, at which point Napoleon was defeated. He abdicated once again, and this time was exiled to the remote Atlantic island of St. Helena, where he lived out his days until his death in 1821. Napoleon's legacy is complicated, as on the one hand, he was a conqueror who wanted to effectively colonize all of Europe and remake it in his image. His unrelenting micromanaging and need to control everything and everyone led to the deaths of 1.1 million troops and 2 to 3 million civilians during the Napoleonic Wars. He was depicted by artists and writers as a tyrant and a colossus stamping around the continent, destroying what he willed. On the other hand, he did continue some of the programs begun during the French Revolution, such as careers open to talent and the Civil Code, which would have an impact long after Napoleon was gone. The nationalism that emerged in Spain and the German lands due to Napoleon's conquests would have major repercussions not just in the remainder of the 19th century, but would carry on in the 20th as well. After Napoleon's first defeat at the Battle of the Nations, Europe's strongest powers met to undo much of what Napoleon had accomplished. The Congress of Vienna consisted of Europe's great powers: England, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. It would be these 5 powers that would work to maintain European peace after a generation racked by war. The Congress set the precedent for later organizations like the League of Nations and the United Nations, an organization that used periodic meetings and diplomacy to iron out differences between European countries before they resorted to warfare. The operating principle of the Congress of Vienna was maintaining a balance of powers. The more conservative nations of Austria, Prussia, and Russia would balance the strength of the more advanced, more liberal powers of England and France. French power was feared, as the country had been starting wars going back to the days of Louis XIV. but it was agreed by the other powers that France was needed to maintain the balance. Plus, what better way to keep French power constrained than by bringing it into an alliance system in which an eye could be kept on it? The Congress aimed to restore much of the pre-1789 world, and so began redrawing territories to recreate states that had existed before the French Revolution and Napoleon, where possible. In some cases, doing so simply wasn't practical. So new states, like the Kingdom of the Netherlands, consisting of both the Netherlands and Belgium, were created. The Congress also tried to re-establish previous ruling families where they could, hence Louis XVIII of the Bourbon dynasty being installed on the throne of France. Britain pushed the Congress to abolish the slave trade, and though it issued a statement condemning the practice, trading in African slaves continued on for decades. The Russians proposed to give the Congress an air of religious legitimacy by creating a holy alliance between all the great powers. However, only Austria and Prussia joined this alliance, while Britain's Robert Castlereagh argued that formal diplomatic agreements did not need any church to sign off on them. The balance of power system would see Europe through some tumultuous years in the 19th century, and only fall apart with the beginning of World War I. Cooperation between the great powers would help stave off revolution, but, as we'll see momentarily, there were other times when disagreements between powers could also lead to important changes that helped to keep the peace. The Congress of Vienna was supported by a new doctrine, a philosophy that justified much of what the great powers chose to do. The philosophy that served as the bedrock of much political thinking post-French Revolution was conservatism. This doctrine, given formal expression by British thinker Edmund Burke, valued monarchies over republics, tradition over change, and religion over reason. Conservatism rejected the Enlightenment for its emphasis on reason and rationality. It also rejected the French Revolution for its, according to conservatives, naive belief that people could simply think of new ways to run their governments and societies and begin implementing them wholesale. Burke, especially, in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, asserted that rapid, foundational change was not even possible, and that it was foolish to try. Rather, Burke argued that any change must be built on existing institutions, that experience would demonstrate what worked and what did not. Change, then, for conservatives, if it happened at all, had to be slow and come only after experience. Conservatives also tended to believe that tradition and faith were two bedrocks on which any and every society was built. They were appalled by the revolutionaries' attempts first to control, then eradicate the Catholic Church. They were also frightened by the radicalism of the Revolution, and how it tried to change things many had believed to be immutable characteristics of a country. For many conservatives, the church, the state, and the patriarchal family set the tone for how things were to be. You can see elements of conservative thought in the decisions made by the Congress of Vienna. Restoring as many countries as possible to their pre-1789 borders was clearly a shot at the radical changes made during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras. Same goes for installing leaders from traditionally powerful families like the Bourbons. Some of the great powers wanting to create a holy alliance clearly indicates the importance of religion to the new system and its guarantors. Though conservatism would dominate the political actions of the early 19th century, it would not be the only philosophy of note, and would soon be challenged by other doctrines that also sought to answer important questions about human life and society. A revival of religion went hand in hand with the emergence of conservatism. After years of upheaval across the continent, many began renewing their faith as a means of finding stability and normality in a chaotic world. The Jesuits were officially recommissioned by the Pope, and Catholic missionaries were dispatched across Europe to bring the church to the people. Methodism attracted people from the lower and middle classes, as well as both genders, as women preachers played a major role in the religion's spread. Missionaries were also sent outside of Europe, to places like India to work and preach. In the U.S., the Second Great Awakening was starting as early as 1790 and saw huge congregational meetings where people underwent intense religious experiences. Another idea that emerged during this period was Romanticism. Like conservatism, Romanticism rejected the Enlightenment emphasis on reason. For Romantics, the Enlightenment erred by thinking that reason alone was the measure of human beings. Romantics valued emotion, imagination, creativity, and nature, and argued that humans could not be reduced to simple, cold logic. Romanticism was more of an artistic movement than a political one. Whereas the classicism we discussed in a previous lesson focused on Greece and Rome, Romanticism emphasized medieval folklore. Whereas classicism valued order and clearly defined lines and subjects, Romanticism sought after disorder and blurred lines. You can see Romanticism at work in the art of Caspar David Friedrich and Joseph M.W. Turner. Both artists focused on the power of nature and how small human beings were comparatively. Their art often presented sweeping landscapes, with characters that seem lost in the immensity of the natural world. Romanticism's desire for authentic self-expression and the search for emotional experience could lead to dangerous pursuits, as the English poet Lord Byron followed his heart to Greece, where he fought in that country's war for independence and died in the process. If Romanticism ever had a political element, it was the support of nationalism. Romantics often sought out tales and stories tracing the lineage of a people back into the medieval past, as a means of justifying support for independence movements in the present. These stories were meant to show a shared culture that had existed for centuries, even if there was no current political state associated with that culture. Romantics and other nationalists continued the fight for freedom even after Napoleon's defeat. The Congress of Vienna, as mentioned earlier, rather than giving each unique people their own country, sought to reverse the clock to how things were before the French Revolution began. For many across Europe, this was not good enough, and a series of revolts broke out in the 1820s and early 1830s that challenged the conservative hold on the continent. In Spain, Ferdinand VII reimposed censorship and faced a rebellion so serious that he needed French aid to put it down and establish himself more securely on the throne. Student revolts in both Italy and Austria were forcibly put down. After the death of Alexander I of Russia, his brother Nicholas ascended the throne, but supporters of another brother started a brief revolt that captured the imagination of many romantics. The conservative order of the Congress of Vienna began to crack over the issue of Greek independence. Greece in the early 19th century was under Turkish control, and when the Greeks began a rebellion aimed at creating an independent country, they found sympathetic ears in France, Great Britain, and Russia. All three great powers broke with Austria and Prussia and went to war against Turkey. The end result was a free and independent Greece and a demonstration of the limits of conservatism. Across the Atlantic, in Central and South America, nearly every nation gained independence between 1800 and 1830. Simón Bolívar led a movement that resulted in many newly independent states, despite his actual desire to conquer the entire continent. In the mid-1820s, the son of Portugal's king declared Brazil a separate kingdom, maintaining the monarchy while breaking away from European domination. Many of these revolts were happening on the periphery of Europe or were not serious enough threats to be worrying. In the early 1830s, however, revolts were taking place in the heart of Europe. In France, Charles X was exiled because of a rebellion that broke out over various oppressive measures, leading to Charles's cousin, Louis Philippe, taking the crown. This rebellion inspired those in Belgium to revolt against being part of the Netherlands. Though the King of the Netherlands appealed to the great powers to intervene, Britain and France refused and instead called a meeting. At this meeting, it was agreed that Belgium would become an independent state that would be neutral in all conflicts, with Britain the guarantor of that neutrality. Part of the reason Austria and Russia agreed to this was because they faced their own revolts. Northern Italy, under Austrian control, was pining for independence, while rebels in southern Italy and Sicily were fighting for a unified Italy. Russia, meanwhile, faced a serious Polish revolt in 1830 that required Nicholas to revoke the Polish constitution granted 15 years earlier, and the execution of many rebels. Neither of these revolts were completely dead. They simply went underground, to emerge again later in the century. Lastly, in England, Burke-style reform was the order of the day. New political leaders came to power wishing to stave off revolt by expanding the franchise. The Reform Bill of 1832 passed and doubled the number of men who could vote. However, only 8% of Englishmen now had the franchise, meaning the reforms were far from revolutionary and far from democratic. That does it for today's lesson. In this presentation, we examine the impact of wars and treaties on Europe. We also investigated developments in philosophy and religion. If you have any questions about this presentation, please leave them in the comment section below or email me if you're a current student. Also, here's a short list of books on the topics presented today if you're so inclined to do some additional reading. If you liked what you saw and heard here, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel and share this video with others you think would enjoy it. Lastly, if you're going to comment, please do so responsibly. There's no reason to be rude or inconsiderate in my comment section. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all next time.